Welcome back to Indus Special. The increased use of drones by Iran and its allies for surveillance and attacks across the Middle East is raising alarms in Washington. According to a Reuters report, the United States believes that Iran-linked militia in Iraq have recently increased their surveillance of American troops and bases in the country by using off-the-shelf, commercially available drones. The disclosure comes at a time of heightened tensions with Iran and underscores the many ways in which Tehran and the forces it backs are increasingly relying on unmanned aerial vehicles in places like Yemen, Syria, the Strait of Hormuz, and Iraq. Beyond surveillance, Iranian drones can drop munitions and even carry out a kamikaze flight where they load it up with explosives and fly it into something, according to unnamed U.S. officials talking to Reuters. But the problem does not just relate to Iran's use of drones. The technology is proliferating, and experts have been warning against the trend. A February 2018 paper in the Journal of Strategic Studies by Emmy Zegert argued that technological advances will soon enable drones to function in hostile environments. Moreover, drones offer three unique coercion advantages that theorists did not foresee: sustainability in long-duration conflicts, certainty of precision punishment, which can change the psychology of adversaries, and changes in the relative costs of war, unquote. On 24th October 2018, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research hosted a side event of the United Nations First Committee entitled The Expanding Use of Armed UAVs and the Need for International Standards. This was co-hosted by the Permanent Missions of Germany and the Netherlands with PAX and the Stimson Center. The meeting determined that increase in domestic production of UAVs, more permissive export policies, and the arming of unarmed systems are all likely to contribute to the proliferation of armed UAVs. These trends may have concerning implications for ensuring adherence to the rule of law and for maintaining international stability. As the face of war changes with robots, lethal autonomous weapons, and the zones of war and peace become indistinguishable, we are entering an era of Internet of Military Things, a period for which we are not prepared legally, morally, and normatively. To discuss this, we are joined by Mr. Lyal S. Sunga, who is an international law expert, joins us from Rome. Ms. Sunga, let me begin with you. As I said, we're not really prepared legally, morally, and normatively for this changing face of war, especially with robots and lethal autonomous weapons and others. The concerns are being voiced, but what measures are being, if at all, being taken?
Well, first of all, I'd like to challenge the premise of your question just a little bit. I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you said, and I agree with it that new technology is certainly pushing the envelope of civilized conflict and war, which sounds like an irony. But there are the laws of war, and those do apply in terms of conflict. But the difficulty is that I wouldn't say that we are in a legal vacuum. And that is because the Geneva Conventions apply in terms of armed conflict situations. So even if there are UAVs and drones, etc., that are being used, that doesn't mean that the primordial, universally accepted principles of armed conflict and hostilities in wartime don't apply. In fact, they still do. What are these? Just very briefly. One is that to distinguish between civilian and military targets, number one. Number two, you can't be attacking hospitals and schools, etc. Number three is proportionality, and there are others out there that are in the Geneva Conventions. More worrying, and you touched on this, I think, extremely well in your introduction, is what about outside of armed conflict and outside state actors that don't follow the Geneva Conventions? And I think there we certainly are in a very gray area between war and peace and blurred situations, and that's much more difficult. So I think that's correct.
My reference was to the fact that as the face of war changes, we're moving from. So right now, there's still a connection between human decision making and the employment of a drone or a robot. But the way things are moving, there's the likelihood, as all experts agree, of having lethal autonomous weapons, where there's going to be not necessarily a connection between human decision making and the decisions will be made by that lethal autonomous weapon on the ground. And we're not really legally, morally, or normatively prepared for that. So I was basically referring to that particular aspect of the situation right now.
Well, I think that could be a little bit exaggerated at this moment, because a lot of the human-guided decisions that we think are human-guided are so much now done at a distance, and there's so much technology involved in terms of targeting, in terms of algorithms, in terms of probability of precision strikes. It's so-called precision strikes. And we've seen this very well with the massive increase that the Obama administration, we witnessed in its use of drones, and how precision targeting didn't turn out to be precision targeting at all. If you look at the numbers of children killed, for example, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, which are in the hundreds from these, I mentioned children because they cannot have been combatants. They're civilians par excellence. So we are already in a situation where so much technology is involved that it's, beyond, the connection is already, since many years, rather weak in one sense. In terms of actual pulling the trigger, it's quite automatic.
Absolutely.
But the conduct of hostilities and the strategy and the tactics, yes, it's still very much a human guided aspect to it. And the robots that you mentioned does raise another whole host of issues. But I would rather see them as a tool of tactical usage in wartime and beyond.
Mr. Sunga, before I wrap up, if we go back in history, when the first nuclear test was done, and Oppenheimer famously said, "I'm become death, the destroyer of the worlds." And then, of course, lots of these Manhattan Project scientists and others, other philosophers, they got together, came up with the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, the famous Pugwash Manifesto, which created that movement. And then, of course, there's been a lot of work on how to prevent nuclear proliferation. But the problem is with technology that once you have an idea, you cannot really disinvent it. So to think that somehow we can put a cap on it, and that's, I think, the irony also and the paradox also. But with artificial intelligence, for instance, we are likely to get to a point, and I don't have a timeline for that, no one has really, but we're likely to get to a point where there will be machines deciding on the basis of a language or on the basis of an intelligence that will be quite independent of the humans.
Well, again, this is a scary prospect, and as I say, machines being used, it can be exaggerated in a way because in the old days, the really old days, you were swords and hand-to-hand combat, but ever since missiles and projectiles were formed, there's been some concern by states at certain points to put a cap on it. But as you say, and I very much agree with your statement, it's very hard or it's impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. And that's why there are some efforts to try to say, well, for the use of UAVs, especially if it's beyond state actors, it becomes just another wild card. But I don't see it as a huge quantum jump up as, for example, nuclear weapons. What worries me, I suppose, is that I'm a bit pessimistic right now because, as Mohammed was mentioning, there's been such a use of double standards, and that has weakened the international rule of law. That's number one. And number two, the state of international relations at the moment is so weak that it's going to be very difficult to get international cooperation with the political will to develop rules that can attack these kinds of things. So I'm a little bit pessimistic at this juncture that there will be any concrete action anytime soon on UAVs, but I would love to be proven wrong on that score.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Lyal S. Sunga speaking with us. This is all for today from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.